Moreover, inputs themselves, it has been shown, especially in the case of India, import of inputs can increase your exports, and it is also positively linked to innovation. Finally, our last channel is learning from exports, imports, and GVCs. This learning stems from the formation of buyer-seller relationships. As you import and export more, you get a better idea of who your buyers are, who your sellers are. You get a better idea of the foreign markets, and in general, you improve from this relationship. There is evidence to show that even a decision to begin exporting induces learning, because when you decide to import, you also invest a little bit in improving probably your transportation infrastructure or just your production infrastructure. The same thing has been shown even in the case of GVCs. However, when you're talking about these channels, there's also a problem of self-selection and endogeneity, which essentially means that the positive correlation between the highly productive or sophisticated firms and their productivity is mainly because the highly productive firms self-select into export markets. The highly productive firms self-select into export markets because there exist costs such as transportation costs, advertising costs that are associated with exporting, and only the most profitable firms in a market can afford these activities. The same kind of idea exists even for offshoring and outsourcing activities. Moreover, the learning from GVCs upgradation is not automatic. You need to have the absorptive capacity and necessary investment for it. Okay, now we're going to look at the trends and patterns in GVC participation. We find that GVC participation has grown since the 1990s, and this rate of growth has been positive in almost all years. And when we divide GVC participation into its two components, and okay, by the way, this graph is for the world. When you divide GVC participation into its two components, backward and forward participation, where backward is the foreign value-added content of your exports, and forward participation is the direct domestic value-added content of your exports, you find that backward participation, which is your foreign value-added content, has increased faster than the direct domestic value-added content. Parallelly, when you look at the intermediate exports and intermediate imports, we find that since the 1990s up to 2010, there was more or less an increase in the share of intermediate goods in your trade basket. However, since 2010, it has come down slightly. But despite this decline, intermediate goods still occupy a majority share of your trade basket. So intermediate goods still are extremely important. That is why we're trying to study the impact of this participation on intermediate goods, specifically the rate sophistication. For this, we adopt the methodology developed by Hausman, Hong, and Roderick. The authors of this paper, What You Export Matters, construct two indices. First is the measure of implied sophistication of goods, which is PRODI, wherein we rank goods based on their sophistication levels. And then next is we use PRODI to calculate EXPY, which is the sophistication associated with a country's export basket. So PRODI is essentially a weighted average of the per capita income of all countries exporting a particular product. The weights used here are the relative comparative advantage that countries have in the export of this commodity. We use relative comparative advantage. In fact, the authors use relative comparative advantage rather than shares to ensure that the size of a country does not distort the ranking of a good. So when you're talking about PRODI, a highly sophisticated product or a high PRODI value product is one that essentially requires a higher level of development or a higher level of income to be produced and exported. The larger the high number of high income countries that produce and export a particular product, the higher is its PRODI. When countries export a commodity, they reveal the commodity's productivity level similar to the concept of relative comparative advantage. Moreover, a product that is extremely technologically advanced can still exhibit low PRODI. This idea essentially implies that there was some element of policy intervention involved, or there was transfer of technology from the high-income countries to probably the emerging market, low-income economies. Thus, PRODI does not intrinsically determine the features of a commodity. Like we have the large classification, which groups commodities into 10 groups. Resource-based, low technology, high technology, medium technology. PRODI does not do that. PRODI does not determine the intrinsic features of a commodity, but rather infers its sophistication levels from the observed patterns of trade. EXPY then is simply the weighted average of PRODIs, where the weights are the share of a product in the country's export basket. So our methodology, we've adopted it from the HHR paper. However, we deviate from their paper in two ways. First is that when they use PRODI, they use HS classification and rank all goods possible. We are sticking only to the intermediate goods, and this classification is arrived at using the broad economic classification. Second, we stick only to the intermediate goods, which is from SITC groups 5 to 8. We're not using groups 0 to 4 because these are largely natural resource-based products like you have primary goods, you have animal exports, you have minerals and metals, and we do not want easy access to these natural resources by developed countries as those products having high productivity. However, there's also a drawback of the source that we're using is that there is quite a bit of subjectivity in distinction. Under BC classification, several goods are classified as both intermediate goods and final consumption goods. For instance, a ball of yarn can be used both by households as well as by factories to manufacture a sweater. So because of this, because we can't distinguish what proportion of goods is being used for final consumption and intermediate goods, we're assigning the entire thing to intermediate goods, which can inflate the size of our export basket. The second is that exports are completely assigned to the exporting country. As I discussed earlier, there has been a gradual increase in the foreign value-added content of our exports. However, we're not accounting for this foreign value-added content. Second deviation is that we're not holding PRODI constant. HHR calculated EXPY separately for all years under consideration that they had in their paper by holding PRODI constant. However, we calculate PRODI for all industries for each year from 1999 to 2018 and use these specific year PRODIs to arrive at EXPY numbers for the countries. The advantage of this change is that we're not only capturing the change in the share of a product in the country's export basket, but we're also considering how the nature of these products might itself change. Why intermediate export sophistication? Like I said earlier, intermediate goods trade is an important aspect of GVCs. Moreover, change in sophistication over time captures a change in the structure of output and production in countries. As a country moves from a low EXPY basket to a higher EXPY basket, it implies that the country has moved up the value chain, which means that has been upgrading. And this movement up the value chain or upgrading can be a result of any of the 4 channels that we discussed earlier. So coming to the descriptive statistics based on the indices that I just described, we find that the bottom 5 products are largely fireworks, textiles, and a few chemicals and metal-based products. When we look at the top 5 products, it is mainly processed metals and electronics. However, we do find the presence of wood-based products like plywood and firewood. This is mainly because some high-income countries such as Luxembourg and Canada have a very high relative comparative advantage in these products, and it is increasing the PRODI value for these products. Okay, when we calculate EXPY based on the PRODI values we get, and we plot these EXPY values, we find that there are 6 major outlier countries, and these outlier countries form a combination of 2 very diverse groups. First is the small but industrialized OECD nations like Iceland and Luxembourg. The other are 2 very small developing countries in Africa and the Caribbean. These countries are present because they have very narrow export baskets, or they have a very high share of high PRODI values in their products. For instance, Zambia has a very high share of manufactured copper products, which is exported by high-income countries like Finland. Excluding the 6 outlier countries, these are the descriptive statistics that we get. We find that the mean values of EXPY have been increasing since 2000. And one peculiar thing here is that the minimum EXPY value, although it's written here as 0, it's 0 point something, for high-income countries is lower than that of the middle and low-income countries in one particular. This is because certain high-income countries are the oil exporting countries such as UAE and Qatar, which do not have a very highly sophisticated export basket. That is why the minimum for high-income countries is lower than that of middle and low-income countries. Or we find that from 1999 to 2018, most countries in the sample have experienced an increase in their EXPY values. Only 22 out of the 94 countries that are remaining show a decline, of which 4 were high income, whereas the rest were all middle and low income countries. Now, these are the top 5 and the bottom 5 countries based on the EXPY values that we get. Again, you find that the top 5 countries are very similar to the 6 outlier countries, and the bottom 5 countries also share the same characteristic with the top 5 countries in the sense that they're small African nations. But the reason they are in the bottom 5 is the same reason why certain countries are in the top 5 is that they have a very narrow export basket or a very high share of low produce commodities in their basket. This is the average EXPY values from 1998 to 2018. We find that it's generally the OECD countries that kind of lie above average, along with India, South Africa, and Chile, whereas the other developing countries are more on the lower scale of this. We also find that EXPY increases with income. As you can see in this graph, where we plotted EXPY values against GDP per capita, we find that EXPY increases with income. And we find one peculiar thing when we compare our results to that of the original paper. We find that first, similar low income and high ranked countries. In fact, the names are also quite similar. But there's one major difference that we find that in their paper, they found that China was an overachiever compared to other countries in its group, whereas Chile was an underperformer. They find the opposite to be true in our results. This is probably because of our export basket. We're looking only at intermediate goods, and China has more or less known to be an exporter of highly sophisticated consumption goods rather than intermediate goods. Okay. We saw earlier that mean participation in GVCs is higher in 2018 than it was in 2000. And we also find that participation in itself increases with income. I'm sorry, the graph has become slightly distorted, but in the lowest row, we are plotting overall GVC participation against GDP per capita, and we find that the slope is positive. The same goes for backward participation, which is in the second row. In the first row, we plot forward participation, which is the direct domestic value added content of your exports against GDP. And we find that although the slope of that trend line is positive, the slope is almost flat, which means that although there is an increase in forward participation as our income increases, this increase is not that pronounced. Okay, so coming to our model, we've discussed earlier the channels through which participation in GVC's export and importing markets affects your sophistication and productivity. And these channels can ideally be divided into two groups. The first is those channels that work through forward participation, and the second is those channels that work through backward participation. Forward participation essentially captures the supply side of your GVCs. It works through scale effects, increase in specialization, benefits from FDI inflows, as well as learning from exporting. On the other hand, backward participation captures the buyer side of GVCs. It works through access to embodied knowledge in foreign inputs, increase in variety and availability of low-cost inputs, high-quality inputs being imported, change in employment structure, benefits from FDI, offshoring, and learning from importing. However, the benefits that you derive from both these sets of participation is dependent on several factors. The first factor is the economy's location relative to the technology frontier that I spoke about briefly during my literature review. And the second is the country's adoptive capacity. We measure the country's location relative to the technology frontier using the Economic Complexity Outlook Index, which is calculated by the Growth Lab at Harvard University. COI essentially measures the number of complex products that are near a country's current set of productive capabilities. A low value of COI implies that only a few products are a short distance away, which according to the calculators of these index, makes it difficult for the country to acquire new technological know-how. And next is the absorptive capacity, which we measure using the human capital index, which we acquire from the Penn World Tables. Also, when we were talking about the channels through which participation affects your productivity, we found that FDI was present under both backward and forward participation. So we also include a variable for FDI as a percentage of GDP. And the data for FDI was obtained from IMF data statistics. We have three other variables. First is the market concentration to see and capture the specialization and the scale effects. The last two variables are policy-related variables. First is the external liberalization, which captures your trade policies, which is our trade freedom. And the other one is our internal policy variable, which captures fiscal freedom and taxes, which is taxes within a given economy. So we're including these variables to test what the impact of external and internal policy liberalization is on our productivity and sophistication. So this is finally the model. These are the signs that we expect. We expect both forward and backward participation to have a positive impact. We also expect human capital to have a positive impact, trade and internal policy liberalization as well. HR index, as the concentration increases, we expect that there will be lower opportunities to specialize, and therefore your sophistication and productivity would decline. However, frontier distance and FDI can go either way. Frontier distance I explained earlier. FDI, again, if you benefit from being a net lender, which is you benefit from FDI outflows, we expect the FDI variable to be positive, and if it's the opposite, we expect the FDI variable to be negative. These are the results that we get. Although we had 100 countries in the beginning, I would like to mention that because of lack of data, in many cases, the sample size has been reduced to 79. 6 countries were initially excluded because they were outlier countries, and the other countries had to be dropped out because of lack of data or missing data for certain variables. So according to our results, we find that for high-income countries, this backward participation has a positive and significant coefficient, which implies that high-income countries benefit from a reduced cost of production, which means they're importing intermediate goods from developing countries and benefiting from it because the cost of production has come down and they can focus on other things. This has been validated by the positive and significant coefficient of FDI, which means high-income countries save on cost of production by importing, which is then redirected towards investment. Grossman and Rossi-Hansberg refer to these as productivity effects. There are also benefits when you offshore part of your production. There are benefits from redeploying labor to more sophisticated tasks. However, for these benefits to exist, it requires that the developing countries have the capacity to move their workers to more specialized tasks. The positive coefficient of the human capital index for high-income countries hints that the high-income countries do have the skill available. In fact, one of the papers finds that relocation of tasks and technological change within GVCs has contributed to an increase in the demand for non-routine workers, which is your skilled workers in advanced economies, but has not done so in the low-income countries. This low-income countries that we find from our results, they do not derive benefit from backward participation, which is negative and insignificant. Even their FDI human capital is positive, but it is insignificant. There could be 2 possible reasons for this. First is that emerging economies tend to be on the low skill end of GVC participation, which means that even the goods that they're importing do not really have that high technological content which they can benefit from. Therefore, they rely more on direct transfer of knowledge rather than on imports. The second reason could be that there is a lack of human capital to absorb the knowledge that is embodied in our imports. And when we look at the share of intermediate imports from high-income countries to low-income countries, we find that the low-income countries are importing intermediate goods from high-income countries. Almost 50% of their intermediate imports come from high-income countries, which means that there is a lot of knowledge embodied in the imports that they're getting. So it means that they do not have the absorptive capacity. And this is what we kind of think is happening, because when we plot the human capital index for select developed and developing economies for the year 2000 and 2015, we find that emerging market economies, the major emerging market economies, do lie below the global mean. In fact, only Russia in 2000 was the emerging market economy which had a higher level of human capital. In 2015, the situation had sort of improved. The emerging market economies, there was a bit of catching up, but still most of them were below the global mean. Thus, developing countries, from our results, we find that they derive benefit from forward participation. These benefits range from increase in specialization due to increase in the number of markets, to direct technology transfer by MNEs, to learning by exporting. However, when you're talking about forward participation and you're talking about getting investment from MNCs to integrate into global value chains as suppliers and to attract investments, the developing countries have to reduce their barriers to trade. And there are studies that do find that PTAs with developed countries have been important in improving the sophistication of the firms located in emerging market economies. Just showing the results again. Along with trade freedom, we also find that internal freedom and internal policy also plays an important role. These serve to enhance the quality of the workforce and also build national competitiveness and attract investors to the country. If there are low tax rates in the country and there is kind of full policy stability and freedom for businesses, it will attract investors to the economy. Moreover, we find that since the 1990s, the flow of FDI to developing countries has increased. So it means that there is possible transfer of technology to these economies. However, we find that our FDI variable, our FDI variable is insignificant. Why? Because although benefits from FDI and technology transfer are real, these benefits are not automatic. Policies such as a lot of developing countries such as India and China have used such policies, but a lot of the emerging market economies have not. And while we're talking about forward participation and how developing countries, the middle and low income countries benefit from it, high income countries also benefit from forward participation. This is because although the share of FDI going to the emerging market economies has increased, a large proportion of FDI flows are still dominated by the OECD countries. Therefore, there is possibility of transfer of FDI and diffusion of knowledge that is taking place between the high income economies as well. And in fact, one paper finds that factors such as ease of doing business, legal assistance, IPR protection, these are all policies that not only are important for emerging market economies, they're also important for the developed countries to ensure that there is transfer of knowledge taking place. Lastly, coming to our COI variable, it is positive and significant. If I can show you the results, it is positive and significant in all cases. A simple interpretation of this index would mean that as a country grows closer to the frontier, the sophistication of its export basket increases. However, when we look at the actual data for COI, this is what I didn't mention earlier, is that countries with low values are not just economies that have narrow, less sophisticated baskets. If you look at the index, countries such as Germany, if you see DEU here, countries such as Germany have the lowest COI values. This is because these countries are so technologically advanced that there are no goods close to its technology, close to its current production basket that are highly sophisticated and that it can absorb because it already has most of the advanced technology. Similarly, countries such as Saudi Arabia and Qatar are the ones that we conventionally think of as being very far away from the technology frontier and thus needing to absorb things. So when you're talking about the coefficient of COI, there are two possible solutions. For countries such as Germany, which are already so technologically advanced, the only way to increase the sophistication of their basket would be through innovation and invention of new products. However, for countries such as Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, there are two possible solutions. One, there's of course innovation, or these countries can simply absorb or adopt the highly sophisticated products that are already existing. Finally, coming to the extensions and implications, developed countries benefit from backward and forward participation. However, the benefit from backward participation is said to be greater, but backward participation implies a lot of labor displacement. Hence, these countries have to ensure that the labor that is being displaced because of offshoring is being redeployed. Inability to do so will lead to an increase in unemployment and discontent within the economy. Thus, investment in skill development and human capital is important for these countries so that if there is offshoring, they can ensure that the displaced labor does move to better, highly skilled tasks. Another challenge facing these economies is that they're too close to the technology frontier. Hence, innovation is very important in these economies. This requires huge investment in R&D and strong national innovation systems to be present. Coming to the implications for developing countries, this set of countries benefit from forward participation, which is dependent on the activities of MNCs. And to ensure that they continue benefiting from forward participation, these countries have to ensure that their economies remain attractive. So factors that improve ease of doing business are extremely important. Policies that enhance contact and communication between MNCs and local firms and facilitate transfer of technology are also what most important. Your PTAs and RTAs have also to be framed in ways that encourage investment flows and not just trade deals. And implementation of horizontal policies that improve national competitiveness and absorption capacity are just as important. So it involves investment in health, infrastructure, labor force training, and education. These policies, in fact, will also help us in benefiting from backward participation, because when imported inputs come and there is a lot of knowledge embodied in them, a highly skilled labor would ensure that we can absorb the knowledge that's coming in. Lastly, this is something related to the previous presentation. There are two major threats to developing countries. First is automation. MNCs would be less likely to shift their production centers to the middle and low income countries if they are adopting automation technologies, which means that they would more likely to be produce goods just in their own countries. Moreover, quite related to this is the fact that increased flow of knowledge from developed to developing countries has meant that developing countries now have access to technology that is just not suited to their needs. Developing countries are generally ones with a very high population and they require a lot of jobs. Whereas in developing countries where they're seeing the population shrink, they've been investing more in labor-saving technologies, which essentially implies an increase in the use of capital. And when developing countries import this kind of technology, they are also increasing the share of capital in their products. And this has brought about more or less capital deepening and skill bias technological change. Both of these things, again, can increase unemployment in the developing countries. Thus, both automation and skill bias technological change can result in increase in unemployment, poverty, and falling standards of living for middle and low income countries. And these countries need to have policies in place so that they can tackle these threats. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Neha. So there is one question in the Q&A box. Can you see it?
I can
Or
see.
should I?
Yeah, can you?
I can read it for you. So the question is, what is UNCTAD Euro GVC database? Do they give backward and forward participation? Which sectors have higher GVCs?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question?
So the first
Yeah,
question
I
is,
can see it. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. UNCTAD Euro GVC, are you talking about the EORA database?
Yeah, that's what they're trying to ask.
Yeah.
Yes.
So the GVC participation indicators that we've calculated has been using the EORA database, and the sectors which have high GVC participation depends from country to country. So you really need to look at the country input-output tables to see which sectors have a higher backward and forward participation. I don't actually remember the sectors at the global level which indicate high GVCs.
Okay. So then there is. So do they give backward and forward participation?
Yeah, they do. They do.
And
So
yeah.
yeah, backward participation, they define it as the foreign value added content of their exports, which they give for all countries. Similarly, forward participation is calculated as the direct domestic value added content, which is DVX in their database.
Okay. And which sectors have high GVCs? Do you have any idea?
No, I'm really sorry. I can't remember that from the back of my head.
Okay. Okay,
Yeah.
no problem. So
Yeah.
if so the attendees can also, if they have a question, they can raise their hands and then I can unmute them. So so there is this one comment. I'll just read it for you. So FDI has no effect in contradicting the existing studies. So basically they're trying to say, so in your results, FDI has no effect. Is it, and they're saying that it's contradicting the existing studies.
No, FDI has no effect in the sense that for the low income economies, for maybe because our probably the sample size is too small, but we do find that FDI, outflow of FDI has a positive effect for the high income economies. We assume that the reason why FDI is not significant for the low income and middle income countries is because maybe a large part of it is getting captured in the forward and backward participation. And like we hypothesized, it's probably because uh, of lack of human capital that is required to absorb the knowledge that is coming in through FDI.
Okay, so there is another question. Can you see it?
No, for some reason I
Yeah,
can't.
I can read it for you.
Yeah.
So mention spillover repatriation impact in home country since home MNCs invest abroad.
Okay. So here the case is that there is no repatriation impact in the sense of how MNCs, the home countries benefit from MNCs investing abroad is that when MNCs invest abroad, they invest in places where the cost of production is cheaper. Hence, they save a lot on the cost of production in their own economies. And this cost that is saved, they can invest in R&D and improvement in technology, which is how there is an improvement within the home countries because of it.
Okay, another one, how to measure spillover and repatriation impact on home country like variables.
So we've tried to measure it using just our participation indicators, but I'm not sure how else you could measure it. Maybe I can think about this and answer it later.
Yeah, okay. So any other questions? You can raise your hand or you can type it in the Q&A box. Okay, I think this is it. Thank you, Neha. Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Sashidharan and Neha. Very interesting presentations. So we will break for tea now, and the conference will resume from 11:30.
11:30.
Yeah, session 6. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Digvijay, and nice meeting you, Neha, also.
Yeah, thank you. Nice meeting you too, sir.
Okay, thank you. Yeah,
bye.
Of the IGIDR conference on trade and development. So we have two speakers today. The first speaker is Dr. Saibal Kaur, and Dr. Saibal, you have 40 minutes to present your work. Post that, you'll get 10 minutes for question answer session. And I request all the attendees to please type in their questions in the question and answer box, and you can take up these questions after your talk is finished. I'll now briefly introduce Dr. Saibal, and then Dr. Saibal, you can go on with your presentation. So Dr. Saibal is currently Professor of Economics at the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta, and a research fellow of the Institute of Labor Economics, Bonn. He's been a professor of economics at Calcutta University and a fellow of the prestigious Alexander von Humboldt Foundation during 2008-9. He held visiting positions at various universities in the world in recent years. He's the managing director of South Asian Journal of Macroeconomics and Public Finance. He also serves as the director of the Eastern Regional Center of ICSSR. His research interests are broadly in the areas of labor economics, international economics, and applied microeconomics, and he's published widely in well-known peer-reviewed journals such as World Development, Environmental and Resource Economics, among others. He's also co-authored a number of books, and he's also undertaken research projects funded by various international agencies, Government of India, Planning Commission, UNICEF, etc. So over to you now, Professor, and we're looking forward to your talk.
Thank you, Bharti, for the kind introduction. And Please do convey my thanks to Professor Mahendra Dev and Professor Viramani for inviting me to this conference. I did not have a paper in full when this message was sent. So I was working on something with my co-author, Suprati Guho, who's a PhD scholar at the center. And I thought maybe I'll just present some of the results here with some mixture of theory and empiric so that I can get some comments and feedbacks from the audience so that I can redefine some of the scope of the paper and also sharpen the purpose and the outcomes perhaps. So any comments, any suggestions either here or many of you do know my email. So if you do write to me, it would be most welcome, right? So if you do allow, I'll just share my screen and tell you the story about the current paper, right? So are we seeing the paper yet? No?
Yes, sir.
No, I just want to go to the presentation and I don't know what happened. Okay, let me just stop share. Sorry. I think I put up the wrong one. Yeah. Do you see a PowerPoint presentation? No? Because I don't see anything.
We can see a Word file, but not.
No. I'm just trying to share a PowerPoint. I think the Word file is also open, which is why it's probably picking up.
Yes, at the bottom we can see the presentation icon.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So that's there. Yeah. And let me show it directly from here because sometimes making it full screen doesn't work. So that's the idea. It's a trade in intermediate goods and the environmental pollution. And like I said to Bharti right now, that I'm going to talk about a small theory and supported by some empirical results, which is not exactly an empirical investigation of the theoretical results per se, but I would try to explain the connections between what's happening at the level of intermediate goods being traded across countries. And then we go back and focus on some of the South Asian countries with respect to their production of intermediate goods, which is sold not only among themselves to a large extent now, but also with the rest of the world, which is the bigger clientele for the intermediate goods produced in the South Asian countries. And we try to see what are the implications for the emission levels within these countries following this somewhat explosion of trade in intermediate commodities. So we have been hearing about intermediate goods and intermediate production trade in the last 2 days, over the last 2 days also. And in many sessions, perhaps it has come back as one of the more emerging issues and as a dominant theme for the current way, the present way international trade is looked at. And basically, so it should typically imply that this explosion of the production and trade of goods and services have fragmentation at its core, right? And the growing internationalization has increased the scope of production fragmentation, which is fueled by the advancement of not only communication technologies, as you can probably see from the writings of Krugman, Hummels, Rajans, and some of the very top names in the field, which talks about why international trade in intermediate goods have become the dominant feature of international trade in goods and services altogether. And the large discussions about virtual trade, which has come up with works of Professor Sugata Marchit and many other people in the area, also talks about how things are processed in between across countries, basically remaining within the scope and domain of service trade. But regardless, it's still like the processing at different levels across countries and then traded to become something which is finally consumed at one or the other country is basically another source of trying to understand how fragmentation really works, whether it's in terms of physical production in parts when something gets produced in India, then gets transferred over to China or to some of the Western European countries or to United States and so on and so forth, or the service component itself being partly made in one of these countries and then traded through the communication technologies to another country, and then the final commodity and the service comes into the fore. So whichever way, whether it's a physical production or it's a virtual production in the service mode, the fragmentation is basically at the core, which does not require further explanation, because actually for quite some time, and one must say that this is neither novel or novel as a concept or novel as a phenomena, because people have been talking about the intermediate trade for quite some time, and sometimes you see that the older and more significant papers which were at the as the progenitor of these ideas somehow go back into oblivion, and I would try to talk about at least one or two such papers so that we can stay back with the theoretical core while trying to talk about the new advantages of looking at additional inferences, both theoretically and empirically, right? So that's...
Sorry for interrupting. Can you please make the presentation full screen? There's a request to make
I can, but sometimes what happens is that it doesn't then roll. I mean, you tell me if it doesn't roll, then I go back to the to the slide mode. So can you see it now? It says introduction and literature on the top.
Yes, yes.
Right. So maybe it will roll. So there has been a rapid growth in trade in intermediate goods, especially within the emerging economies also. So I'll show you a graph where with the Indian example becomes very prominent as far as the intermediate trade in intermediate goods and services are goods, basically, not services, are concerned. Now, this is, like I said, has been of importance for quite some time, particularly with work of Kalyan, Sanyal, and Jones, 1982. It's a very famous American Economic Review paper, which talks about the stages of production where the value addition takes place at the local level once the commodities are half done, semi-finished, and then transported over, sold over to another country for further processing and consumption, perhaps. In terms of trade, you can always open up this possibility that the transfer of commodities at the production stage might actually come back to you as a final commodity and for consumption through either pre-processing arrangements or buyback arrangements, or the same way the FDIs and production outsourcing has taken place for this long 20 years from the United States to China, from Western European countries to China, which is why China, as it is well known to all of us, that became the backbone of the international manufacturing production, because they would process, they would complete, and then send back the commodities to the countries of origin, which is what the my concern here comes in, because if we now start talking about the questions about environmental pollution, which was absolutely neglected in terms of the intermediate goods production, then there are implications which has not quite been understood at the theoretical and the empirical level, right? And I do not claim by any means that I would give you the final answer to this, but this is an approach. This is at least an effort to see what it might have an implication for the emission levels in a country where the pattern of trade has shifted largely towards intermediate goods trade compared to the final goods trade and consumption. And this is the reason why the question about pollution comes into the forefront, because following Sanyal and Jones, the implications about intermediate goods trade have somehow remained confined within the production reorganization, because Sanyal and Jones talks about different different stages of production when it comes to, say, the airline industry or the production of small scale manufacturing goods, electrical items, or food processing, where one country produces one half or one third of it and the remaining country produces the other portion. And that stages of production was basically about the reorganization within multinationals themselves, or by connection with a completely different firm outside belonging to a different country, right? So whether through arm's length trade or through proper trade where multiple entities are involved in this kind of relationship, we are still talking about production reorganization, right? Or you can talk about what happens to factor prices because of this kind of changes happening in the trade pattern. And of course, with the income distribution per se, whether it's the import competing sector that suffers from this kind of trade, or do we have a connection between the export and the import competing sectors by trying to process things by importing some of the other things. So it's basically about production reorganization leading to certain kinds of development outcomes, right? So Jones and Sugautam Marjit also has a paper in AER which talks about this kind of possibilities where the production fragmentation has implications for development outcomes, generally speaking. So if we extend this slightly more towards the public economics angle, where the the environment plays a major role in trying to understand also the development implications. By the way, can you see a graph here?
Yes.
All right, so it's fine. So that's the statistical motivation, so to say, because in terms of intermediate exports to the rest of the world, you can see there are various blue lines, many shades. I cannot probably distinguish which one is which here, but it at least tells you that if it comes to machines and electrical intermediate goods trade, it's vegetables, some fuels, chemicals, plastic and rubber, which are typically the semi-finished goods produced in India, of course. And again, these are common knowledge. I don't need to tell this audience about the product mix or the trade mix for a country like India. But it would typically mean that we still remain largely around the domain of primary commodities, right? There should be little doubt that these are somewhat advancement beyond the primary commodity, because we are still talking about animal, vegetable, processed fuel, food products, wood, metals, right? These are processed, of course, to some extent, not directly from the mines, but processed to some extent, but not finished commodities by themselves, right? And this volume, sometimes 15 billion, sometimes $90 billion vis-a-vis rest of the world, is significant when it comes to our share of international trade. Because even yesterday, a lot of people were saying that India's share of international trade, despite all this export spurt and openness to trade, has not touched a remarkable level yet. So if a large portion of that is confined within the trade of intermediate goods, then one has to see what implications it has for several things. We talked about the development aspect slightly, production reorganization surely, and then on environment is another angle one can potentially explore. And I would tell you about what has already been talked about in this regard. So we try to understand this question, that is there a relation between international production fragmentation and environment. So we focus on the empirical validity of a positive relation between exports of intermediate goods and the rise in environmental pollution in terms of greater CO2 emission, right? So, and you can talk about SO2 emission, you can talk about various other indicators of what the typical indicators of environmental pollution, but just from my empirical purpose here, or our empirical purpose here, I would stick with CO2 because it's part of an ongoing research, and we can bring in some of the other factors to see if this is robust across different types of indicators. And to see to place this empirical question in perspective, I talk about a bit of theory here. with some implications or some exemplification from cross-border transboundary pollution kind of a situation, right? That would be a special case, would not be the only case, because I'm open to international trade between a developed set of countries and a developing set of countries through the intermediate goods transactions, right? But within the South Asian countries also, a new possibility, or including China in the process, a new possibility of transboundary pollution is coming into the picture, which is also somewhat less understood in the current circumstances. And by which I mean, because at an anecdotal level, we always hear evidence that India keeps on sending. Now you see, in the current regime, we are talking about high growth phase happening in some of our neighboring countries, right? And that's happening because India is sending, and not the only factor, of course, but at least one factor, as you can probably see from some available statistics and definitely from anecdotal evidence, that India do trade with Bangladesh and Nepal and Sri Lanka a lot of the intermediate goods. So India sends a lot of auto parts to Bangladesh for assembly, and it comes back to India to a large extent, right? So this opens up in some possibility, the cross-border or the transboundary pollution kind of a situation. And it's definitely true about the transboundary pollution relation between China and India, because we share common water bodies, common water resources, which flows from north to south. And it's a clear possibility that the pollution created upstream will have impact downstream. And if China and India, and despite all this animosity and trade war that's opening up, the protectionist regimes that are cropping up, we still have a lot of trade relation with China, right? So this $40 billion deficit doesn't come from nowhere, and exactly for the same reason, one sees that in North American country, the very developed United States has the largest trade partner in Mexico, right? Which is definitely an OECD country, but way below the development standards of United States. So this developing country combination leading to transboundary pollution and trade in intermediate goods is somewhat the theoretical motivation, right? And like I said, the transboundary pollution is just one example. You can expand it to non-cross-border, non-common border kind of element as well. The results would remain more or less similar. So just to cut short some of these available definitions and literature, a recent paper which kind of reiterates Sanyal and Jones, it's by Atukorola and Yamashita, which talks that cross-border dispersion of component production, which is PCAs, basically the components, parts, and accessories, through component production and assembly within vertically integrated production process, with each country specializing in a particular stage of the production sequence, would define the scope of production fragmentation the way we kind of use it in this paper. So the expansion in the international production fragmentation leads to higher derived demand for imported components. At the same time, the growing trade in intermediate goods affiliates international production specialization, right? Again, this is known to the current audience. I don't need to explain too much about it. And the vertical integration is the reason behind such producer-driven fragmentation, right? So we are trying to connect between two different stages. There are competing theories which says that since two developing countries might not have the access to credit in full, then a credit-linked relation between production fragmentation is a very viable explanation behind this kind of vertical specialization, because one country produces, given its credit constraints, a portion of the output, and then it transfers it over to another country through its vertical integration linkages, and the other country, given its own credit constraint, finishes it off, and maybe then the trade starts happening between the two countries, right? So there are multiple multiple examples and multiple ways of trying to see how this vertical integration and connection between multiple countries in terms of the intermediate goods trade can become a reality and become a very potent source of creating other implications in the system. So the phenomena, like I said at one point, of international production fragmentation can either take place through arm's length transaction or through direct FDI movements. Okay, so the economies of scope and the competitive advantage in industries would basically tell you that more labor-intensive commodities such as garments, footwear, toys, etc., which are basically consumer-driven fragmentation, coexist with the producer-driven fragmentation in significant industries such as semiconductor, automobiles, heavy industries, and these are also more capital and technology intensive in nature. So the pollution that might be generated in the production process as also in the consumption process in the recipient country might be either somewhat outcome of a labor-intensive production process or a capital-intensive production process. I'm going to show you in 2 minutes. Professor Nandwani, please do inform me 5 minutes prior to the closing time.
Sure.
Yeah. So in this case, the production is carried out by setting up vertically integrated system of production, like I said. And in case of final goods, the trade leads to production and consumption of pollution in spatially different locations most of the time, right? So you produce something, you sell it off to another country, and if there is some pollution-laden consumption happening there, and automobiles are the most prominent examples, perhaps. Take, for example, the countries of the Middle East, which does not produce automobiles, but they use cars and sometimes even racing cars to a very large extent using local pollutants like fuel, which is very cheap, of course, right? So production definitely takes place in Germany, in Detroit, in some of the other, in Italy, in France, you name it, in UK, you name it. And then, and that's one source of pollution generation. And when it comes to the Middle East, for example, then it just consumes, and there's another source of pollution that's generated. But the overlap and the multiplicity of the pollution as it happens with stages of production are not present under the circumstances, right? So when you talk about production being broken up into multiple stages, then one part of the producer related pollution generation would be in Germany, and the other part would be in Middle East if Middle East is complicit in producing the remaining part of the final chain in the production system, right? That does not happen when it comes to production and consumption of the final goods, right? So this is a subtle difference and maybe a very important difference actually when it comes to measuring pollution out of intermediate goods production. So if the final good embodying intermediate good is traded back and imported, then multiple sources of pollution also opens up, right? So it's not only that production spreads pollution in multiple countries due to this breaking up of the production process through fragmentation, but if there are trade of the pollution-laden commodities, because some of these commodities, trust me, we have seen it before, and definitely people who work in international trade and in the interface of international trade and environmental economics can vouch that some of our imported commodities are definitely the source of pollution in the recipient or the destination countries, because these are